So I'm Kyle McCormack. I'm the lead of the media team, and I'm hosting this little discussion.
I'm Paul Matthews. I'm president of the BC Libertarian Party.
I'm Clayton Welwood. I'm the lead of the outreach team for the BC Libertarian Party.
I'm Bill Morrison, the deputy leader for the BC Libertarian Party.
All right, so I want to start off with the sort of big ticket item that we've been talking about really for the past 2 years as we're developing our policy. We've been talking about which taxes affect sort of the poorest people, which taxes are hitting sort of the working poor and the middle class the hardest. It's actually insane. People don't necessarily know how many things they're paying taxes on or how many times taxes are applied.
Oh, we got the gas tax, we've got the cigarette taxes, the liquor taxes, we've got the carbon tax, land transfer taxes, we've got the sales tax, of course, the income tax.
I would also add just the cost of doing business, user fees and so on. And it piles on, and most people don't realize. I think most small business owners are the ones that really get the gist of it. It's when people are, say, just everyday workers, they don't really realize what the cost of doing business is in this province.
Throw up the Canadian taxpayers. They do an annual, they call it a gas tax honesty day report. So this is the 22nd annual one that they've done for May 2020. And you can see that they've got it broken down by province. And so what they're saying is that on average across Canada, 52.5% of the pump price you pay is taxes. And so that includes, carbon taxes, transit taxes, which in Vancouver, that amounts to 18.5 cents a litre. So it's a big one. Federal excise tax is 10%. You've got a sales tax in there as well. You've got a GST. So the total tax for gas in Vancouver on a litre, which selling for $1.20 or something these days, is 50.5 cents. And then you've got out of that you've got tax on tax of 2 cents because they're applying taxes to taxes, which is just the most infuriating thing you can imagine.
And a key thing with the gasoline tax, that gasoline and petrochemicals in general, whether it's diesel or jet fuel or oils and lubricants and all that, all of those things are taxed by virtually every level of government, here in Vancouver, and certainly the provincial and federal governments are taxing all of that. And to Bill's point, it's a major increase to the cost of doing business, and by extension, it just increases the cost of living in Vancouver. When you tax a primary energy source like that, everyone's input costs go up, right? So you think about a plumber that has to drive all over the city, visiting clients and all that. To fill up his truck or his service van, with all of his tools. It's not like he can drive around in a Tesla or a Prius. He's got tools and kit and everything else to take with him. The cost for him to fill up his tank has to be passed on to the consumer, right? And then just all the other costs of doing business. But energy, whether we're talking BC Hydro and their ridiculous rates, and I know that, it can be argued that they've got, fairly low rates, but we still pay for it as taxpayers, right? And
for now.
Yeah, well, they say that they're making money or they're not losing that much money, and that the cost of electricity is fairly low on kind of the balance of things across the country. But, again, we know that BC Hydro's got major debt issues and that we're eventually going to have to bail them out. Much like what ICBC is going through and BC Ferries is going through, so all of these monopolies and all of these taxes and everything just kills the affordability and makes it impossible to do business in British Columbia, or at least very difficult.
Yeah, one thing I would add to that, Paul, that just impacts nearly everything, is the cost of real estate. Right, and so taxation is a significant component of that. There's GST charge on that. The big one is the property transfer tax, which is going to be 2% on most residential property.
And I mean, we're talking tens of thousands of dollars for any major development, right? So,
yeah,
there again, the developers have these input costs, the taxes just add to that. And so what happens? Housing goes up, or housing prices go up.
And the developers are always the bad guys when you're looking at the debate amongst housing affordability advocacy, which I'm all for the idea of affordable housing, but what I'm not for is the shell game that gets played, and also the blame game that gets passed on to the so-called greedy developers. And then the government just kind of gets to step back, and they always are going to have their hands in pockets of everybody regardless. So
yeah, the developers should be held up as heroes, right? They're the ones actually building the houses. And what people don't realize, it's like, okay, there's some high demand here in Vancouver, and a lot of the new stuff that you see going up are, luxury apartments and luxury townhomes and all that. But what people don't realize is that today's luxury suites and luxury apartments are tomorrow's affordable suites. We have to build new houses, and people want to improve their quality of life. So newer, more modern houses are going to be built. People that can afford them are going to move into them, but they're going to in turn vacate older, more affordable places for everyone else. Right? And that's just how it goes.
And as long as the zoning laws don't encourage all those older ones to be torn down, which seems to be happening in large parts of Vancouver. So I would love to see that fixed.
Zoning laws are among the biggest problem here.
Totally.
And I know this idea comes from ultra left-wing Portland and Oregon, but they actually had a really interesting idea. And I think the gist of it is that they made it impossible for municipalities to zone a neighborhood exclusively single family, right? So you look at the majority of Vancouver, I think it's like 80, Clayton, you might know the statistic. I think it's like 83%.
It's around 80% zoned for single family detached.
Right, and so I don't know if you guys have ever flown over Vancouver, it may be a small plane or just coming into land in the airport, but when you fly over the city of Vancouver, it is just a giant grid of suburbs, right? And so when you are restricted from, building apartment buildings or densifying and actually responding to the demand, everyone wants to live in Vancouver, right? So that's why it's expensive. It's a supply and demand issue. And when every square inch of land is taken up with a single family house, that's a major problem. And I understand that people buy into neighborhoods and they don't want to see, their next door neighbor's house be torn down and have an apartment building or a duplex put in. But, getting right down to the libertarian principle of this, is it really anyone's business what goes on someone else's property?
Yeah, that's a difficult one to transition out of. So I don't know, maybe on a future episode of this podcast, we could kind of get into some ideas of how do we shift the system of neighborhood change and development that gives existing owners some kind of a stake in the process, where they don't just want to dig in their heels and fight every new development because they want to protect their property values and the look of their neighborhood. But just going back to the affordability thing, which of course, the cost of putting a roof over your head is one of the biggest ones. It is the biggest one in this part of the world, like without a doubt. But it also trickles down to other stuff we buy. I mean, look at how zoning has restricted the level of commercial development, right? Because just like multifamily housing is constrained to very narrow areas around Greater Vancouver, the same is true for commercial development. And so you're trying to be an entrepreneur, you're trying to start a business, run a restaurant or whatever, just leasing that space that is zoned to allow what you want to do. Same goes for industrial. You want to run a mechanic shop or whatever like that. It's the same type of problem. The space that is allowed to be put to that use is so limited that, of course, the cost is going to be way higher than it needs to be.
It's amazing. It's amazing how we've gone completely away from the origins of Vancouver and how it was, originally, settled and laid out, there was no zoning, basically for the first 50 years, I believe 50 years for the founding of the city. And to your point, Clayton, you're exactly right. You look at all the mixed use properties all down the main streets, right? Granville, Burrard, Main Street, Fraser. And if you drive down those streets today, you can kind of see what the city of the past used to be, because all down those strips where there's commercial development, you see where it just comes to an abrupt end. You can tell where the city was when they changed the zoning rules, right? Because all those commercial shops are mixed, like they'll have apartment buildings, attached right to them, and they're all older buildings. But you can kind of see what the original layout and just how it organically developed. And then that you reach a certain block, and from that point there was an urban plan put in place, and they didn't allow commercial. It's just this big sprawling residential development, like you said, no industrial space. In fact, the last 10 years, Vancouver's pretty much kicked out all of the industry purposely.
And the other thing to touch on as far as the cost of doing business is that the way the taxes are implemented is best and most use. So what most people don't even realize is, as frustrated as they may be, regardless what your opinion is of how high rises or mid rises, a lot of these businesses, if they're zoned with the potential to have a 10-story building above them, they're actually taxing that imaginary existence, which makes it practically impossible for the small guy to even operate, because they're paying, most of their landlords are charging them what they call triple net. Mm-hmm. And they have to pay the taxes regardless of what their rent has been agreed upon. So their taxes go up. Essentially, your lease, the cost of your lease is going to go up, which I think is really ridiculous for the government. They're kind of playing both sides of the coin, because they're almost forcing those landowners to sell their property based on that so-called zoning. And then what happens is a developer is going to come in and build for best and most use. Of course they are, because everybody needs to get the best return on their investment. Yeah.
I think part of the other issue too is, they don't want their properties values to go up because they want to stay in their houses, and but they don't want to pay more taxes. And so, there's that's an incentive for opposition to any sort of development, right? Whereas if, the property value went up and they weren't penalized for it, well, maybe they'd be a little more willing to accept that apartment building next to them, right? Because their equity would go up, their value, their wealth would actually go up. Whereas right now, that's not the case. Every time their wealth goes up, it's being confiscated.
And they always find different ways to do that. And they want to pitch it to the public. And it is really kind of sly what they do. They call it a school tax, or so on and so forth. And then that's the way that you get the public support of such a thing. Well, why can't somebody, just for example, why can't somebody that owns a $3 million home pay more in taxes to support the schools? It sounds great on the surface, but that's not the reality of it. Somebody that owns a $3 million home maybe didn't pay that, first of all. And then second of all, if that money was actually going to schools, that would even be a better situation. But we all know that's not the case, is everything just kind of gets pulled in and they spend at will.
Yeah. And when it comes to new housing and just this conversation around property taxes ongoing, I think what sometimes people forget is that there were a lot of taxes, and not just taxes strictly speaking, but other costs imposed by government, let's say, that drive up that initial cost of a new home. So let me just share one more thing with you here. So this one is from 5 years ago. It's from a group called the Independent Contractors and Businesses Association of BC. So that they include construction companies and developers and so on. So you can see at the bottom here, this is average regulatory cost per housing unit. So most often we're not talking about a detached home, because most of the new housing stock being built is condos in Vancouver. And this would just include, permitting fees from the city. It would include like development cost charges, right, where the municipality gets the developer to pay for some kind of public amenities, whether that's public art or public infrastructure. So averaging in 2015 around 28,000 per unit, although going high, where I live in North Van District to 40,000. So it's a big initial baked in cost when people pay that sticker price. Then they're paying the municipalities over the life that they own that home. It seems like an ever increasing amount in property tax. Even though it's funny is with this greater density, you would think that, okay, well, if we have more taxpayers supporting roughly the same amount of infrastructure, and I know it increases, they got to put in a new sewer line now and again, but a lot of time it just seems like more taxpayers paying for roughly the same amount of infrastructure, but yet the cost per taxpayer keeps going up. Even the rates keep going up, even though the housing valuations are also going up. So everything's going up.
Yeah, everything's going up. You're right, Clayton, and the infrastructure is not being repaired. We can take a look around the Lower Mainland here. We look at the Massey Tunnel, the Patello Bridge. If anybody's ever driven over that lately, that's a nightmare in itself. But there's always that excuse. That is the reason for taxation, which I think most Canadians and British Columbians tend to agree with. However, we don't actually get that return on our investment. And that's where I get extremely frustrated, because on one hand, not only are you being overtaxed and people not even realizing how much money is coming out of their pocket going into the government coffers, but you're actually not getting the best value for your money.
Yeah, and we can maybe speculate about where that additional funding has gone to at the municipal level, but I've heard that their payrolls have just been growing a lot.
Well, right off the bat, we can refer to the Canadian Taxpayers Federation again, and the Fraser Institute. It's no secret that the public sector on average makes 30% more in wages than the private sector. And then let me tell you, I've been in the private sector my entire career, and I have never met anyone that has a pension. Not in modern days, right? And I've worked with big companies and small companies, and that's just not something that's offered, and yet that is a standard thing in the public sector.
Yeah. And it's not unless it's self-initiated, and that's usually what you get in the private sector is they'll maybe match any kind of contributions that you're making for yourself and what have you. Yeah. But the public sector, it's almost a guarantee.
Yep.
Everyone should be able to afford a house at some point in their life. The way the situation looks right now, a lot of people won't be able to. So clearly something has to change. But I can't get over this 50% of gas being taxes. And when you sort of combine that with the idea of what you guys talked about with the situation with zoning and with property taxes forcing people to use the most profitable, like only use the land for the most profitable, most bang for your buck. It just gets me thinking, like, what could people do with all this extra money? Like, we know, as you said, the money isn't going where it's supposed to go, especially the gasoline tax. We know this for a fact.
Well, let me tell you the first thing, right? Everyone out here wants to have, environmentally friendly everything and low emissions. Well, let me tell you, if I could save half the amount of money I spend on gas a year, I would buy a more fuel efficient vehicle, right? Right off the top. Or if I owned a home, let's say, I would renovate my home to be more energy efficient, windows, or, replace the roof, or get replace the wood burning fireplace with a natural gas furnace, or, whatever it may be. All of those things, I would spend my money on improving my life and making it better. And when you buy a modern vehicle, they are more fuel efficient than older vehicles. And you can even get an electric vehicle, right?
Or multiple, even if you could kind of pick and choose. If say in a situation where you're a contractor, or some people can only afford one vehicle, and they have to drive their work truck around because they can't afford a secondary vehicle, which segues into the cost of ICBC and so on. But we won't go down that right this second. But you could, in theory, own a a vehicle that's your workhorse, and you could use that for work, and then you have a vehicle that is your commuter to pick up groceries and stuff like that, and that would just make life so much easier. But also, to touch on your point, Kyle, is I think it would really benefit those that are less, a little bit on the lower end of the economic scale. Those people are the ones that suffer the most. It's not the people that are making, 6 figures or more a year, and regardless of how they spend their money necessarily, it just keeps those folks that are on the lower end of the economic scale, their heads are underwater and they can't get it.
Yeah, it pushes them down. I mean, to be really crude about it, like, we're talking about two different classes of people, and one of those classes of people, they're not watching how much money is going in the tank. That's a background thought to them. Whereas there are average, everyday British Columbians who are deciding, like, okay, I can only put $20 in the tank, and I got to be real careful this week because otherwise I'm not going to be able to put food on the table by the end of the week. Like, these are the real decisions that, yes, the poor working class or those who are, on the lower distribution of the economic scale, who are working full time, but maybe are just barely making ends meet. They're the ones who are getting hit on these gasoline bills.
Going back to what would you do with the money that you save? Well, if I was, a small business owner that employed a dozen or so people, and again, had to, rely on those people being mobile, to make service calls or whatever it may be. If I could save some money in my business, I'd probably hire more people. Right. And that's, that's more taxpayers, that's more economic growth. That's all a good thing. Right. So, the high taxes prevent a business owner from hiring people. And then the second point I want to make is that, on the gas taxes and the commuting, like you were saying, Kyle, I think that another thing that people don't realize is that it's the lower income groups that often have to commute the farthest simply because they can't afford to live in the inner city. Right. So you've got people that have jobs in Vancouver that are living all the way out in Langley.
Everything needs to be shipped. And that's the bottom line. So when people are trying to purchase those very things that they need to get by and to fill their lives, then what happens is that those costs are just going to constantly go up. And it all ties in together. We were talking earlier about commercial taxes on commercial businesses, and now we're talking about gas taxes. That is not, all those hidden taxes are not paid by, quote unquote, the corporation. There's not a slush fund that goes into just pay the taxes. It's always going to end up coming out of the consumer's pockets.
And the employees.
And the idea, from the other side of the table, I guess, progressives would be, well, okay, we're going to have more public transit and so on to help make this easier for people who, can't afford a car. But there's all sorts of issues with that as well. I mean, one of the potential solutions was supposed to be ride sharing, right? But the way that our provincial government has brought in the regulatory framework on that, it hasn't turned out to be any more affordable than taking a taxi, which, as we all know, is not cheap. I mean, I would have loved to see a regulatory framework, just getting back to what you guys were saying about that choice to take on a second vehicle. Right? If you don't have to own that vehicle yourself, you can somehow share the cost of ownership with other people, but have access to it. And there are some car sharing co-ops that have started up lately in Vancouver. So that's good to see. But it really would have been nice to see a regulatory framework for ride sharing that allowed it to be cheaper than taxis. But
should have been one rule: have insurance.
Yeah, well, and I think that's on the other side. I think the reason that they had done that is because of the taxi lobby. And I'm not one of those people that thinks the taxi lobby is necessarily an evil. I think it's a necessary evil because they are actually fighting against the regulatory system of the government. Now, I don't think a lot of people realize this, but when I tell them this, it blows their mind because if you're a taxi driver, and they've almost caused this issue themselves, but if you're in, say, Richmond and you drop off a fare in Coquitlam, you can't pick somebody up in Coquitlam and bring them back to Richmond or Vancouver for that matter. And that, for me, when I first learned that, it blew my mind because you have somebody that's driving all the way to Coquitlam and then they have to drive back to their home base, so to speak, which would be Richmond.
You're blowing my mind right now. Why is this a rule? That's the most insane thing I have heard.
I believe it
is crazy. It's a bit of a bureaucracy.
Well, it's a cartel structure, right?
Yes.
I mean, what else can you call it? It's a region. It's divided into regional cartels, or they call it licensing, but that's what it is.
There's a couple taxi companies in every little borough around Vancouver, and they've got exclusive rights to their borough to pick up fares. Basically.
And they're their own worst enemy in that sense, and it's really just partly because you're trying to do business with the government, and that's what I think happened there. If there wasn't any kind of infrastructure set up there where they had made these rules up and were charging people, through the nose in order to operate a taxi, I really don't know how they do it personally, even with the expenses of taking a cab in this city. I couldn't imagine trying to run that as a business. It wouldn't be something I would choose.
Yeah, no, it's a tough go. And I actually appreciate your sympathetic outlook on the taxi industry. I hadn't quite thought about it that way, but it actually makes me think about the same sort of situation we were talking about earlier with homeowners, having, purchased in a neighborhood with an understanding of the regulatory environment being such that it wouldn't really change significantly during their tenure of ownership. And even though they didn't create that regulatory framework, they bought it with a price and with an understanding that that's what it was. So then changing it becomes difficult for those people, right? So it's again that tricky problem of how do we change the system and not hurt those people who have invested in it.
It's very similar to supply management, right? And not to go down a whole different aspect on the federal side of things, but when people had to buy into supply management, and we want to scale that back and open up the market, the challenge is that people have actually paid for the right to do business. And I could imagine as a business owner, I'd be extremely frustrated if all of a sudden the rules change. I had to pay for the luxury of doing business in that industry, and now all of a sudden people have jumped in with no regulatory body and no rules to the game. So that's where I think happened with.
But the problem is, really what it, everything from supply management to the taxi regulations and ride sharing and all that. Really, what it does is it just makes life easy for a small group of people. Right, but we've seen instances where countries or certain jurisdictions have lifted those kinds of schemes, and it's actually resulted in more business, for those people. I think a prime example is when New Zealand eliminated their supply management, and it was the same thing. It was instituted during World War II, and it was meant to ensure food security. But as soon as they lifted all of that stuff, New Zealand's agriculture industry went global. Like, they went absolutely bonkers. They're selling cheese and goat milk and all sorts of stuff to Asia and even over to Australia, and you can get it at boutique places in the States. You can't do that in Canada. And Canadian producers produce for Canadians and Canadians only. And it's because they're incentivized by the government to just produce what they produce, and that's it.
Exactly. And for anybody that wanted to test this theory, all you have to do is you go to the supermarket and you can find a brick of New Zealand butter, grass-fed butter. It will cost probably about 4 times the amount of what just not even the equivalent, just a general run-of-the-mill Canadian version of that same butter.
But at the end of the day, right, so if we eliminated the taxi regulations, across the province, or at least, here in the Metro Vancouver area, you have to think that would benefit every single taxi company, right? Because they would be able to actually do business across the entire Fraser Valley without having to go back to their home city. They can pick up fares and all. I mean, there would be.
Yeah, it could make being an individual entrepreneur or owner, I guess, in that space more profitable, right? You could earn more money in the same amount of time or less amount of time. So it actually makes it a more viable career or business path.
Well,
right?
so it is a double-edged sword. It is a double-edged sword. We should be charitable because the reason why there is a lobby is because it will expose them to competition, right? That's the flip side of this. Now, we know as libertarians, as free market guys, that the little people will benefit. The workers will benefit. The individual taxi drivers will benefit. It's the guys who are comfortable and they've got their taxi business, and please don't rock the boat.
And they're sheltered.
These guys.
They're sheltered under the rules.
Exactly. They are perfectly fine paying a little more here and there to eliminate swaths of their competition. And again, if you would like a perfect example of that, look at what happened to ride sharing.
Yep.
If ride sharing had been allowed to come in with the loose regulatory framework that it enjoys in other places, the taxi industry would be done.
We're shutting out 80 or 90% of the potential market to protect a very small few, basically a cartel, like Clayton said. Right.
So I do want to.
I want to make one more point, Kyle. Other point, related to transportation, and Bill, you raised the Pattullo Bridge. We're doing it with labor in British Columbia, right? We are completely excluding any private contractors, any small businesses, and all construction projects that are paid for by the government in BC must be done by a small group of approved unions.
Yeah, no, that's exactly just to Clayton's point there. That's exactly right. They call it whatever it's called. If it's a government program, you can be assured that it does precisely the opposite of that. If it's supposed to benefit the community, there's a good chance instead it benefits a small number of well-connected people and not the everyday guy who's got a shop on Main Street.
Yep. Sure, and this is true right across government policy. If you look at it, for the past couple hundred years, I mean, Frederick Bastiat was talking about this, 150 odd years ago. It's the government regulatory framework being captured by producers, but really what would be in more interest would be to set government policy in favor of consumers, right? Which inevitably means having an open market, allowing people to compete, and this drives prices down, which makes life more affordable for everybody, including the poorest people in society.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would even touch on Clayton, your point there. One of the things that I hear from some people is that, well, it drives prices down, then what happens is that that business suffers. Which my pushback on that is generally, well, it drives prices down across the board, including the cost of their materials and the cost of their doing business, their overhead in general, and so on and so forth. And that's my definition of inflation. I not that so much the textbook version of inflation. It's the cost of doing business is going up in every aspect of your life. It just makes those people that are trying to get by suffer that much more.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so this is the bow I sort of want to pin on our first episode here, because I think what you've laid out is a pretty good argument. All of this is done in the name of progressivism. It's all done to level the playing field. Oh, there are people and they've got too much, so we're going to set up some regulations. We're going to raise some taxes. We're going to raise some more taxes on the people who are really doing well, and on and on and on until suddenly the average Joe working at a grocery store is paying 52% of his gases in taxes. And then all of a sudden, these aren't progressive ideas. They are precisely and exactly regressive. They are keeping the people who need to get ahead the most behind the most. So for our last 10 minutes here or so, I want to flip that around, and I want to lay out the libertarian vision of a British Columbia with a simpler, way less intrusive taxation system and a set of regulations, whether it's zoning or the taxi industry or what have you, that benefits the little guy, that makes it easier to start a business. What does this BC libertarian plan start to look like?
Like, I think the number one thing for affordability is the cost of real estate and housing. The main thing that makes a difference, because here's the issue. There are going to be wealthier people in society and poorer people in society. So relative, income disparity, I think is a feature we can't get away from without, bringing everybody down to subsistence level. So if we want to have some level of prosperity, there's going to be people who are going to be making more. where push comes to shove is really, can you put a roof over your head? And we've seen over the last few months with this economic crash that the government has precipitated in response to COVID-19. A lot of people are losing their housing. We've seen homelessness growing, and then people just not being able to have stable and adequate housing. So my ideal would be, can we make it so that somebody who is earning $1,000 a month, maybe just getting like an $1,100 a month disability check from the government, can they put a roof over their heads that isn't, like some horrific rat-infested SRO in the downtown east side? Like, is it possible to build housing that is, Spartan and basic and small, but that can serve this element of the market of people? I just don't want to call it a market. Let's just call it's people trying to put a roof over their heads in communities in BC. Can we allow housing to be built at that kind of a price point? Right now we can't. Developers cannot do it. It's not that they wouldn't want to, it's that with all of the other costs that we talk about, it just doesn't work. You can't draw up a business plan that makes it work. So that's why everybody's turning to subsidized housing and public housing and so on. But even that is very expensive and can't be built without taxpayers footing the majority of the bill. That's a huge boost to keeping people from falling to the level of poverty where their lives completely unravel because they don't have a roof over their head.
I think there's proof that it can be done, Clayton, and it's been the proof is in various different aspects where you could bypass that regulation and the regulatory bodies. And there's when the government goes ahead and tries to pat themselves on the back for building housing and modular housing in various areas of the city, and even Indigenous bands, when they've been able to build on their own land and limit the amount of the regulations that have been applied to them, you can see the costs are greatly reduced. But it's not championed. It's not announced at the top of every newspaper on how cheap housing could be if only we could get the government out of the way. And I think that if we could actually make a strong case for a lot of people and show them where a lot of that money is going, and even the restrictions of something as simple as parking spots. I'm not a developer in any way, shape, or form, but there's a lot of things that I've read where I hear that they need to have X amount of parking spots for the X amount of units that they have, which doesn't happen on various different properties that are owned by Indigenous bands and the government themselves. And so that there is proof right there, because if you have to allot X amount of space of your real estate for parking, well, that's what they charge, I think, 20 to 40 grand for a single parking spot in some buildings, if not more. Those are just the little things that could really open the public's eyes.
I think from my point of view, I think that one of the biggest issues facing British Columbia today is the cost of transportation, right? And there's so many different facets we can attack that from, whether it's, ride sharing and taxis to just the cost of expanding public transit systems, the lack of private options when it comes to transit. Like, I see no reason why. Actually, there's a good perfect example is on Vancouver Island. They want Wilson Transport wanted to set up an express bus route between Victoria, Nanaimo, and Tofino. And the transportation, the Transportation Safety Board, or I can't remember what the provincial government body is, but there's a committee that reviews these things, and they said, no, there's not really a market need for that. We're not going to let you transport people between these points. And I was just livid over that, because Wilson Transport they're in the business of doing that. And I'm sure they did their market research and they identified, a little niche that they could have addressed to get people between, two of the major cities on Vancouver Island and get them out to Tofino and back, right? And yet some dumbass bureaucrat got in there and said, no, we don't think people want that. Well, you know what? It's let Wilson figure it out. They'll either succeed or they'll fail, right? And oftentimes that service has to exist first before people will demand it, right? So it's just ridiculous that we've got these central planners going in there and doing that. And then on top of that, building out the infrastructure, limiting the amount of labor that's available to build new bridges and replace tunnels and, all that kind of stuff. Look at the cost of fines in BC, right? There's a couple groups out there that point out that a lot of the stuff that's done under the guise of public safety is really just a cash cow. Red light cameras come to mind. A lot of the distracted driving laws, there's not really a lot of evidence to suggest that the laws actually change behavior or improve road safety at all. And then the gas taxes, right? I think the gas taxes are probably the giant elephant in the room that, we could go down that rabbit hole for hours and talk about how it eliminates economic opportunities for the lowest income earners. We can talk about how it hinders small businesses. Just the cost of energy and transportation I think that's the biggest anchor on our economic growth and the prosperity of individuals in the province, myself.
I feel like we could probably talk about any one of those subjects for another hour. We could pick out each one of those and talk about them for an hour. And one of the biggest problems British Columbians are having is sort of connecting the dots. And that is why we're doing this podcast. A lot of the examples, you have to actually give anecdotal evidence or these little cases and these little moments. Like you mentioned, the private bus route that wanted to set up on the island. People don't know that happened. And so that's what I think we can do with this podcast and what we've been doing for the past few years on our blog, on our website, which is libertarian.bc.ca. So I think that we should immediately get on the next episode of this podcast and lay out a case for a more affordable British Columbia. Head over to the website. It's libertarian.bc.ca. You can join the party. You can volunteer. You can join your local group that's set up in your area. Get on the mailing list. Get involved. If you like what we're talking about, get involved. We need more help.
We do.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for inviting us out, Kyle.
Thanks, Kyle.